Hey, Brandon.
Hey there, Toddy. How's it going today?
It's going well. How are you?
Doing okay.
Okay.
I think I should probably ping Amy and see about getting this moved on the calendar too.
Okay. I will be. I just wrapped up another meeting, so I'll take maybe 2 minutes break.
Take two.
I'll be right back.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Few times I actually use that here when there are only 14 people on the channel and it's actually time for a meeting. I'm typically the person that says, oh no, never use that thing. Amy is amazingly efficient. Put a request in, she knocks it out in 30 seconds.
Hey, I'm back.
Hey, Toddy. All right, so we didn't have a fixed agenda today, but we did have some action items left over from last week. So I figure we could go off of that. The first one was creating a new repo. We did that. So that got knocked out. We've had that created. I threw some initial documents in there. Feel free to open PRs, suggestions, changes, anything else like that. We can tweak that up so we need to. And then with the rest of the time today, I was wondering if folks wanted to start tackling things like use cases to start documenting what we want to make sure this working group covers. Would that be, yeah, go ahead, Dottie.
I just had one comment on your PR. Sorry.
Yeah.
looking at my background.
It's to the point.
I forgot that actually I have this back. My only comment was you had one statement that a resolution will happen in certain, but I'm not very clear really how we're gonna resolve, let's say, sticky points. And I've seen that in OCI that happen, as well as a few other projects that happen that I am managing. And maybe if we are a little bit clearer on what is the process to resolve those things, that will be good. But everything else, I looked at your PR that was already merged. I just added the comment on the merged PR.
Yeah.
That was my only comment there. And I'll be happy to talk about use cases, which is actually the more interesting part than how do we make decisions.
I put a comment on there. I'm not too worried about us getting stuck, mainly because of when we came out of the refers group, we were first so good at working together, but also everything we produce has to go through multiple layers of other approvals after us. Mm-hmm. It's got to, we're going to merge it into some other existing spec out there. They've got to approve it. It's going to get released by that spec that triggers all their voting and everything else. So yeah, I mean, if we get stuck and we can't come to like a good solid agreement, us getting this approved upstream is going to be like a non-starter anyway. So I'm hoping there'll be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's the short version. The longer, the other side of that is if you want to tweak it, PR, I'm cool with that. Mm-hmm. If you think there's better phrasing there, go ahead and throw something up and we can merge that.
I will prefer not to kind of do that, but I trust you. I trust majority of the folks. I hope things will not happen as in other places. Just that is because I don't want to spend the time to go and write some governance document that actually it's like 3 pages explaining how we make decisions. That I don't think that's the point of this group, but I just wanted to kind of raise the concern because I saw that in few places already. I hope that CNCF can actually go and define that CNCF wide, and we can just go and say, okay, this is how we make decision, and every CNCF project can leverage.
Hopefully.
Okay. Short distraction.
No problem. Gave me a second to say hi to Amy real quick here. Apologies for my pitter-pattering and distractiveness here. I'm also trying to see if we can get Rom to join in because Rom was saying we're meeting now. So hopefully we'll get him to jump on as well. So in the notes, I'm just going to keep track of this. And if I type without sharing my screen, everybody's just going to think I'm being rude. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And open up a couple windows because if I don't have these opened, people start chatting and I don't see it, and then I'm oblivious to everything. So from your comment there, so short version hopefully won't have many, but also okay, let me see if I can get Rob on this meeting because he lost her invite already. 1 second. I hope I shared the right one. Well, I gave him the whole group link, so we'll get him here in a second. All right. Yeah, so let's talk about, my goal here is try to get us to include kind of some use cases, anything that's not covered. I would say even anything that is covered by the Docker spec. Let's just kind of start brainstorming what use cases do we think people are going to have for this down the road. So take this out.
I can start with a couple that I experienced.
Yeah, go for it.
So yeah, the first thing is like I'm really confused with how do I get the right permissions to read the catalog. That is because when I go and actually, I looked at the diagram that Josh posted from the last meeting. Right, it's a good diagram, but most of the time, like when I do, let's say the first request, right? I do a request and I want to read the catalog, and Docker Hub, for example, replies to me, yeah, this is the kind of the scope that you need to specify when you authenticate. I do that, and then I get the let's say the bearer token for that specific scope, and I try to read the catalog and nothing happens, right? It says you are not authenticated. That works in one way in Docker Hub, in a different way in GHCR, in a third way in ACR. Those are kind of the three that I pointed out, but really having the right permissions to get the catalog and knowing how to get the catalog, that is one of the things that really bothers me lately, because I need to do different requests for each actually vendor at the moment, and I don't know whether that got anywhere covered.
I'm
the
curious,
second thing, yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious with those requests that you're doing. Are you looking up each vendor's specific API? Or are you actually calling the _ catalog API itself, which I'm pretty sure Docker Hub just says, no, not going to happen. I thought a lot of registries did that as well.
Yeah, Docker Hub doesn't support that, and I don't think I'm not aware of any that do.
So are you using like the cloud specific API for searching under like a user namespace or something like that?
Is that for me or for?
Yeah, for you, Toddy.
Check. No, I'm using the v2 _ catalog.
Okay.
Yeah, and my expectation is that if there is such API, that should be like, and yeah, I know that I can use the specific one. I think that the problem is that that's kind of abstracted, because different vendors like Docker Hub, for example, doesn't have a single repository, a registry that kind of gives the whole catalog, like how they filter, for example, the private ones. And this is kind of the next point that I was coming to, which I don't know whether it will be part of this working group is, but if, for example, I don't have permissions on a certain namespace or repository, right? When I request, so the first question is when I actually request the catalog and I don't have permissions on that, how the catalog will know to filter those ones that I don't have permissions on. The second thing is like, if I, let's say, authenticate or use some pseudo-anonymous token as currently Docker Hub has, but I want to actually browse such a restricted namespace, right? What are the calls that I need to get to redefine the scope and get a new token for that particular scope? And whether I need to do that for every repository, or whether actually one blanket token will be enough for me to go and do the browsing. So those are kind of the things that have been on my mind. The reason I'm asking is because we have more and more customers saying, look, we would like to use a single, let's say, registry, but we are looking to actually have much more granular control and not say you have read, write, and delete permissions on the registries, but you have actually permissions to read those namespaces and read and write in those namespaces and not do anything in any other namespaces.
Yeah,
Ram?
Ram.
Yeah, sorry, joined the meeting late and missed the last meeting. So at least, so let me just say what I wanted to say, and then you can ignore it if you like. So at least from the interactions with the registries, there are typically two types of workflows. One is a UI type workflow, which is mainly for release managers and things like that. So what they do is they want to go and browse and look at things and things of that nature. So there is an authentication workflow there because it's a UI kind of a workflow. And then for developers and the CI pipelines and things like that, we have it. These are driven by tools that don't have potentially interactive capabilities. So it is situations there where we use password, tokens, and things like that. So these are two types of distinct workflows, at least from what we have seen. So whatever we are trying to address needs to address these two separate workflows.
I'm not sure if I caught your second one. Was it you're asking
for
about
example,
different
Scopio and things like that? Let's say that if you want to do if Scopio wants to talk to a registry, so its authentication workflow may be quite different. For example, if it is OAuth 2, OAuth's workflows are different depending on whether it's a UI based workflow or is it it's a client tooling type workflow. There are some differences. So
yeah, I agree with that part, and you're right. We need to address both of those.
yes, so these are two different stakeholders there. Yeah. So
yeah, but kind of from use cases point of view, I see actually both needing kind of the same capabilities when they authenticate and obtain the relevant token, right? Because we have, for example, tooling that does some, for example, interpretation of, let's say, a catalog or a tag list for repository and so on. So it's not like assuming that, let's say, when I run a tool, it will only act into the scope of a single, let's say, repository.
Cool. Did you have any other ones, Toddy?
Those are the main kind of two. I don't know whether there are two, there are more than two, but those are kind of the main ones that I had in mind.
Thinking through, and Ron, if you had a second one, go ahead and let me know. Otherwise, you might have a stale hand up. Okay, I'm going to assume it's a stale hand. Thinking through the catalog API, I want to extend that to saying, how do we handle authentication for any extensions? We've defined how you can add extensions into the registry API. How do you authenticate with an extension into the API? What does that look like? And so not so much with, but to an extension that's in the registry. So if someone has an extension for a new search capability in the registry, how do they authenticate to that? If we add other extensions doing other stuff. And then the other generic thing to throw in here is authenticating for anything that is not repo specific. So I'm hoping between the two of these, I might be covering your use case, but I'm just kind of throwing them out there because I feel like these are probably going to cover potentially other use cases that are out there.
Yep.
I think that's one that's technically kind of covered by the spec and Docker already. If you read between the lines, at least we've interpreted it as such internally at Docker to add in non-repository resources and sort of authenticating via other mechanisms. So that might be one that's sort of covered already. We just might need to clarify that a bit.
And just to make sure, when we talk about non-repository resources, we are talking about those two things, like the extension and the catalog, or do we have anything else in mind?
I think right now the catalog is the only API that's there, and that's not even an OCI API.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, did you have some thoughts on that?
No, I was wondering the same question, and Yeah, so you were talking about other types of APIs for managing the repositories, that sort of thing, indexes, other tools, things not currently covered by push-pull distribution APIs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically any extension that someone adds later on down the road that they want to put some kind of authentication on doesn't need to look a little different when you try to use whatever we're defining here.
Yeah, as defined right now, the token request, really specifically the way Docker implements it's resource type, resource name, resource action. It's those three things together. And for a registry, it's repository name, push, pull, delete, star, what have you. We've interpreted that to, we definitely have some non-repository resource types that we've leveraged that same thing using resource names that are not repositories, using actions that are not push pull, but sticking with that type, name, action format, which has scaled fairly well for a lot of other things internally.
So as you change the push or pull out to a star, did you have other values for that?
The resource types in question do not use push or pull or star. They're they are action specific to the different type. So it might be
adding or changing, modifying permissions for something for someone, right, in the repo,
Or an admin role or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, so maybe this is defining a list of the actions that go with a particular resource type. Could be a good thing to define out of this. Hey, if we're dealing with repositories, here's the concrete actions we support. Because I know some of them will support star, some of them will not support star. Some of them will take admin, some will not take admin.
My hope with the output of this is that we get that to be something that the registry tells the client that it needs, not that the client would have to know in advance. And so that would mitigate our need to define that full list, because the registry defines whatever its list is and just tells the client, okay, you need to get this access.
Yeah, I think, Brandon, one of the things, you might have a different way to split out the artifact API, right? The refers API, for example, might require a different permission than push pull.
Yes, but the direction I'm thinking of going with that is that the client doesn't need to know that. The registry itself decides that I'm going to set up a different kind of authentication for the refers and do that. And when the client requested the registry, when the client makes the request, the server comes back and says, you need to get this authentication from this auth server to have access to that task. And so the client doesn't need to know these in advance. And that would be a nice way to change some of these problems around.
But you're thinking a fail first pattern for the Auth API. Okay.
It's the way a lot of it happens already, I think, in a lot of the HTTP specs. So we're a little unique in how we define some of our workflows. And so I'm not sure how much we can leverage some of the HTTP specs on that.
Yeah. I think one of the things I was hoping we might be able to cover is some pluggability with this, with respect to this kind of thing. But maybe not. Let's see where it heads, and then we'll talk about that later. In other words, if one of our patterns for access requires a different thing, right, like permissions to be downloaded with some scopes, then we might need to do something else for somebody who's doing authentication, right, or verifying certificates or whatever way that it's being, this authentication tool is being integrated into our patterns for the models that we're going to support. It won't just be Docker's current model, is I guess what I'm trying to say, right? Thanks. The Signode call got over early.
Glad to have you here. So from this, I also want to kind of hit some of the high levels of other things in there. Any other points on that before I start adding more bullets? So I'm going to take the step all the way back to Signode and say we just need a basic pull an image. Just thinking of the simplest use case out there, someone has their container runtime and they just need to pull an image and they need to have access to log in and query it. And so I don't expect that's going to create any special extra error for us. I just want to make sure it's documented that little things out there. And I'll say not just pull, but also push. So pull, push, get them both in there. So between those two, I think we got the simplest stuff out here. Some of the other more complex ones that I know a lot of us have chatted about before is the cross-repository blob mount. That one needs a little bit of extra effort for how people do those logins. And I think most registries just assume if you've got access on the target and then they try to use that same credential on the source, but I don't think we've ever really documented that too well. So how that should work, how that can work, that would be interesting. And then another area that I think we haven't done much effort in documenting is long-running services that have some kind of authentication. So
Policies.
long-running clients that have a persistent connection to the, may not have a persistent connection, but they're constantly going back to the same registry over and over again with credentials. How do we time out a credential? How do we handle a,
Yeah.
how do you handle some kind of credential that eventually expires and you need to re-authenticate back into the registry server? How do you handle a client that is talking to a dozen different repositories? Can it do all those logins concurrently? Does it have to have a login per repository separately in its system? Can it just have one big
Now you're
auth
talking
token?
about guidelines. Yeah. Yeah, the guidelines can be very important here as well, right? Especially when you have,
Yeah.
you're running on a cluster, you're on a node, you've got multi-tenant, right? Pod A,
Yeah.
he has access and has downloaded that image. What does that mean? What if pod B comes along, it's in the cache? Is he allowed to use that image?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so it's not just timeout of credentials. It may also be timeout of the, access or, some kind of a requirement, right?
And some of these long-running clients, I've got tools for registry mirroring and also caches. Anything that's basically you're running consistently and creating a whole lot of different repositories constantly on a registry server. You might be hitting more than one repository. And so how do we handle that when we've been pulling this thing for 2 hours and all of a sudden we decide that credential is no longer valid? What does that workflow look like?
Encryption, decryption.
Okay, where are you going with that? Fill that out a little bit.
On the push, it's encrypted using a user side key.
Are you talking about encrypted images?
Yeah, encrypted,
Okay.
decrypted, images, artifacts. We need a use case for that as well.
And I'm wondering if that's going to be under login or if that gets broken out because it's how the image is pushed. But I'm getting everything on the list here just so we can think about it.
That's what I'm just adding a couple things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the brainstorming session, folks. So I'm running close to the end of my list here. Do other people have items on yours? If not here, okay.
There is also a use case about CDNs, right? So I don't know if you want to capture that as well, just to put it out there.
Sure.
So at least when we think about it, we can think about it about this use case as well.
I have often thought that I want to rewrite my own pull through cache at some point, but I have not found the free time. Apparently that is a thing that I frequently lack on. More ideas and time to implement them all. But how this will work with a CDN would be interesting. I'm looking through some of our initial list here. The different Auth methods. So
Do you want to at least, are we just going to do images now, or do you want to cover some of the artifact patterns like scanning, authentication? I'm sorry, signing, that sort of thing.
So you want to get artifact scanning and signing?
Yeah, scanning, signing, certificate of authority providers. Is that interesting here? Or is it?
Keep filling out how you think it would, how you see the tie-in. I'm not saying no. I'm gathering everything I want. I'm just gathering for the brainstorming here.
Well, if you got third parties, you're going to need to know who their certificate of authority is going to be for both the client and the server to be able to support some of these artifacts, right, and trust them.
Yeah, I don't know who raised their hand first. Might have been Toddy.
I have one more that actually goes more into authorization, what we were talking. There was a Kubernetes actually embargoed fix, or there is often embargoed fixes, which actually it's in the same repo, but just a particular tag needs to be protected, and which goes to a very low or granular level of authorization. I don't know whether we want to cover that one.
I like that. I don't know if we're going to be able to solve it, but I like it.
Yep, I would like to solve it if possible.
Jeff.
Or at least enable the ability to solve it through our tooling, right?
Yeah, I mean, I just thinking of what was brought up last week and just kind of the goals and outcomes of some of this. But there's definitely some of these that fit much more the let's at least document current state before we start diving into wish list kind of things. And should we start segmenting this list based off of what is currently out there versus what do we kind of hope to add? Because I mean, just kind of given the existing OCI spec, if we try to define it as is everything that we want it to be, we're probably never going to get anything actually released, versus if we at least get a first pass out of this is current state. We understand it's not ideal, we understand it falls short, but at least let's document something, get it out there. Now let's iterate. We might have a much larger chance of success getting stuff out.
And we can definitely go through, I think, each one of these and put like a little current versus future on each one, pull them into two different lists, something like that. Good call out. Just leaving the awkward silence here as people think to the brainstorming. And I'll also kind of go back to our original list because I probably have something in here that I've forgotten about. You can kind of guess that I wrote both lists because I'm hitting the same bullet points in both of them.
not sure if we should talk too much about this, but support for redirection. Should we fix that?
Is that redirection to an authentication server, or is that handling? Some of that is the CDN is and its own stuff. So I think Ron might have hit that one.
Okay. Yeah,
But-
if it can be covered in CDN, that's fine.
Yeah, but otherwise, I'm trying to think of where else we would see redirection within some of these calls here. Not saying we won't. I'm thinking off the top of the head.
Just today, it's just the original connection, right? It can be easily redirected from the client to another server. We might want to consider that, at least a client option to disallow in some patterns that we build together, right? Or perhaps after authentication, then we do the redirect, right? And we're given the redirect with the token from the authentication server.
So is the concern there that you want to be sure that the client doesn't get fooled into giving its credential to another third-party server?
It's more a concern that we haven't covered the redirection scenario yet, and it is currently available.
Okay.
So we should talk about that pattern. When redirect is used, what should we be doing on the client and server side to allow or not to allow? And it might be related to the extensions that you had up there.
All right. Any other thoughts people have on this?
Quick point. Did we also consider anonymous access to specific repositories or just the registry in general?
It's a good one. Really good one.
Yeah. What is the scope of anonymous? Yeah. Definitely should apply to some of these other scenarios.
Right.
And also anonymous access to the catalog. Not to forget.
Exactly, Todd. That's what I was thinking to myself. Oh man, what happens when I change it to private? There goes the anonymous connection. But if we don't have timeouts on the, yeah. Are we worried about boiling the ocean yet?
I'm not worried about that. I like getting a whole lot of these written down. I'm not in any way claiming we're going to solve everything here, but I just like getting the ideas listed, mainly because one of the bullet points in here was to make sure that we don't prevent future extensibility. And so if we get some of these ideas that we start thinking of, hey, this would be nice to have, it's good to get that written down so that we don't document some capabilities or specify something that blocks us from ever being able to do something.
Right.
So we may not get tag level restrictions in here today, but we can at least consider that when we're coming up with the solution of saying, how would that affect someone trying to implement that in the future? Cool. This list is super helpful to me. And I kind of want to sit with it for a while and to the point earlier, to break it apart by which these items are today, push and pull an image that's there today, versus which things, if we're going to talk about, mutual TLS is, I think registries support that today, but I don't think it's really defined, but we do define some of the auth tokens, and we definitely don't define something like a tag level fine grain access control. And so
Well,
I think
the Docker spec allows for it, and we've experimented with doing it. So the way Docker currently defines it, it is feasible. The registry just needs updated to account for it.
so how would the registry do a fine grain access control for a tag today? In the Docker spec.
Attach the tag as part of the resource name that's handed over in the scope.
Okay. So does the scope have an extra colon in it?
No, it's just, yeah, you just pass in that as part of the resource name.
I'll have to look because I don't feel like I've seen
I
that.
haven't
last
used
time I
It
looked.
does not necessarily work out of the box right now, but
Yeah.
it does technically work the way that the auth server is defined. It is what I'm getting at.
It's been a long time since I looked at that. Well, kind of a long time. Maybe it was there and I just missed it. Entirely possible. The other half of stuff that I want to do today is start pulling apart, not pulling apart, but gathering a list of what specs we want to be considering. And so the Docker spec is the obvious big one. But also if we want to start going out and finding some RFCs and other stuff out there that might be important for what we're trying to implement. Is that a good use for our time here today, or would that be more like a homework assignment?
No, you're going down the right track. Along with that, we need to consider is, are we going to have some kind of a common source in the spec as well? For example, resolver, right? It's common code shared across all the container runtimes to be able to connect to a Docker-like registry or other types. So is there a place in one of in a new spec or in the distribution spec for additional code, or what do you think? Are we just going to do a spec? This is like towards the Docker team as well, right? A lot of these things we're talking about are Docker specific repository type stuff, but then there's also things like how to connect. It would be nice if there was some common code, but it should be pluggable, right? To be able to make these connections. Otherwise, how are we going to write the test cases? How do you do an auth test case, right? In our current distribution API. I would propose you're going to need to bring in, at least today, Resolver, possibly some other code from Artifactory or some other teams that would provide a plugin for the authentication, right?
I know when we were talking a while back of expanding a reference out, that was said that, hey, let's just get that code documented and pushed out there. And if we're going to do it in OCI, it's typically going to be pushed up there as Golang. And if someone wants to do some other implementations, we'll let them have their own space to implement if they want to do it in Python or something like that. For authentication, of the times I've seen it implemented, it might be different enough that it would be interesting to see what a library like that would look like.
Well, hopefully after we've specified the use cases, we can create some data structures and some patterns and at least try it out. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Are we coding? Or are we or just writing specs? Yeah. Maybe we get some volunteers to,
My goal is to start with a spec. I'm not opposed to writing code. I enjoy writing code. I just want to make sure what we write is going to be useful to everybody out there. So I'm thinking of how many different use cases there are out there and whether we'll be able to implement something that's valuable to a lot of them.
I know the cheating a little bit. I know the Docker tooling, and I know how pluggable and extensible it is already for doing different kinds of, authentication. But I'm not sure, how much of that's, in an open containers kind of, open source Apache 2 or whatnot. I'm not sure.
Pretty
I don't
sure
know.
I went down the path of looking at the container D Auth a long time ago, and I got partway into it, and then I realized it really wasn't designed to be used by what I was trying to use it for. And so
Right.
I'm thinking through, okay, well, container D had it one way, and I'm going to look at it for a different way. And
Yeah, I'm not
distribution
talking about
is
container D. I'm talking about resolver code that has been modified since container D started with that initial version and became pluggable. Just maybe, I don't know.
when you say resolver code, are you talking about resolving the reference, or what are you resolving?
Yeah,
might not be-
resolving making the connection to
Okay.
Rich,
Okay.
which includes authentication.
Yeah. I think I've seen multiple attempts at that. So it'd be interesting to see if
Yeah.
that got pulled into a library.
Yeah, it would. Yeah.
So I'm not gonna go around searching with my screen share, because who knows what Google will come up with. But other than just looking at some of the HTTP RFCs, do we have specific RFCs that people want to think of in the HTTP area that we should be looking for? Is it, when we look at some of the stuff, is it OpenID Connect, or is it a different version that we've documented? It's just a token request in general.
OpenID Connect is one implementation that people are familiar with. So
If we have mutual TLS there, that's already I don't know if that's a spec or not, but might just be TLS times 2. Any other specs that I should go searching for? Or is Mike going to do all the searching for me? I'm good with other people want to do searching for me. That works too. Does this one have both? What I'm looking for is, does it have the token and the basic? Auth scheme token, yeah.
Yep.
All right.
Maybe. I think that's the right
Probably.
thing.
Probably. I know I've gone through and dug for these in the past, so.
Yeah.
That'll be a good one to include.
Yeah.
Oh, we got 10 minutes left here. Any other? And I'll go through and take up some of these, fill in the doc ones easy enough to find. I'll fill that one in. Otherwise, I can give you back a few minutes, because I know people like to have a quick break between meetings sometimes. So I don't intentionally hold everybody hostage. But I will take at least this stuff. And in addition to just capturing our notes from the meeting and putting those up there, I'll work through this and make a little section on kind of the use cases that we're thinking of and other supporting things, and kind of get that somewhat structured in our working group repo and get that up there as a pull request here this week.
Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, this has been productive for me, so I'm happy with this so far. Awesome. In
One
addition
of
to
the
that,
things I was hoping to solve, just before we cut out, right, is on the client side. I was hoping to do more system integration with key rings.
yeah,
We're not properly securing the credentials pipeline from Kubernetes down to the connection to the registry. And at least from a guidance perspective, I'd like to see something like that happen. It would depend on the pluggability and how we're doing the the client side.
I had started going down that path in the working group proposal, and I got pushback on that to say, let's not talk about what clients are doing. We didn't want to say, here's how clients are storing their credentials.
We said
as part of our spec.
It's in
we're
space. We could reframe it.
we put a lot of use cases out there that we may not necessarily get to, but that was one of the things that people pushed back and said, let's keep that out of scope. I think the reasoning they didn't want to get into, here's how the Docker credential helper works, because they're afraid that we're going to start getting vendor specific definitions in whatever we're creating.
Yeah.
So just because we said it was out of scope in our initial chart there, I'm trying to respect those boundaries.
Fair enough. Hey, if you can get your credentials out of a secure, then that could be another pattern, a blog we can write somewhere else.
Some of this may come back to how we're thinking about the long-term clients, because they might be more inclined to hold credentials in a system where they need to go back and periodically re-authenticate versus a client that just has a static password, just going to reuse the same password again.
That's why I mentioned policy. As soon as you brought that up, I was like, how are we going to get this policy? How are we going to understand between the registry and the server and the third-party providers of this content? Where do they specify that? Does it go? Do we have an image spec artifact or something that goes in there that says what the scope is when you build and push it to your private registry, so that when people log in and pull it down, they at least know what the policy was supposed to be, and then the client can implement.
For me, where it makes sense to kind of separate the two sides of this is when I'm defining the reg client side of this, I'll pick the use case I know a whole lot about the code in. I will get the credential from a Docker helper or any other kind of credential helper, and I know that I can query that again in the future if I need to. And then I have to have something in there that knows a feedback from the registry. Maybe it's a authentication failure or something like that from the registry, that I know that I need to expire that auth, go back and re-get a new auth credential and go back to that workflow. And so the dividing line for me is not how the client stores that credential, it's how the registry communicates to the client that it needs to regenerate that credential.
Okay. And how it's validated, the certificate authority. That's why I was mentioning that. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Good. Thanks.
Well, thanks for a good productive hour, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. And for most folks, hopefully I'll see you back on the Thursday meeting.
Cheers.
Yeah, folks. Thanks.
Take care. Thanks.